Yeah. So, I mean, I grew up in a social climate that was very much about the capstone marriage. Like, it would be an embarrassment if you got married before you were, certainly before you were 28, maybe even before you were 30, a little bit like, I remember feeling like, okay, if I don't, there was a window maybe between 28 and 32, like you had to hit that window, maybe 28 and 34. Like that was the time where you had to meet the right person and settle down. And if you did it any time before then, you were sort of like a rube. And if you did it after that, then you're risking, you've got fertility issues and all this kind of
Mm.
stuff. And it's such a tyranny. It's rooted in this like really sort of upper middle class bourgeois post feminist fantasy about self-actualization in your 20s and meeting the right person because you have achieved a certain professional standard. I mean, I grew up thinking that the older I got and the more established in my career I got, the more attractive I would be to men. And I'm
Sweet
laughing
summer
because it so
child.
seems so laughable now. but I mean, I've talked about this with other women. It's like, oh yeah, well, I'm not going to, settle down with my boyfriend that I have now when I'm 24 because when I'm 28 or when I'm 30, I'm going to have like a much nicer apartment and I'm going to, have a cool job and I'm going to have better clothes and I'm going to know different sorts of people and I'm going to have so much more to offer. And I think that that mindset, it was very, very rich, in the 80s into the 90s and into the aughts. And I mean, I'm curious if you have thoughts about when that started to shift. Like, when did we start to relitigate a lot of these ideas? Because it feels like to me it's only been in the last maybe even like 5 to 8 years.
Yeah, I mean, I got married when I was 25, and I come from
Hmm.
that same kind of
Big loser, Louise.
right, yeah. Well, it was considered to be a bit weird, and actually, my she didn't say so at the time, but my mother-in-law did say subsequently, like, I was worried you were too young. Um, my husband's a little bit older than me, but even so. Yeah, and it was a kind of countercultural thing to do. I mean, the impression that I get in my social circle, but this is just anecdotal, so these are people who went to fancy universities, is there's a kind of bifurcation that people either marry their university girlfriends and boyfriends. I know quite a lot of people who did that and do so in their 20s, maybe late 20s, but 20s. Um, and have kids relatively, in their from like 30 onwards, or they don't, and people end up being single for much longer and maybe choose not to have there's kind of like you people's roots diverge quite early is just my impression, but then generally my like education peer group is like 35, so there's still time yet for things to change.
So the thought was that if you don't find somebody when you're at university, you're not going to be able to do that. You're not going to, when you're out in the professional world in your 20s, it's going to be much harder to find somebody, even though you have the networks, you have the connections and the networks from that university
Yeah, I mean,
and other
maybe
ones.
what's being expressed there is more that the people who, if I was to put it rudely, describing my team, the marriage early people, is that we may be more temperamentally willing to settle, whereas the other stream are more like, if I'm going to settle down, I want it to be with someone perfect.
Right. So we used to talk about that as getting set in your ways, which is a very old fashioned way of putting it, but there's no better way to put it. That's absolutely true. I'm an outlier. I mean, I've always been different. I mean, having children has never been a priority. I mean, I certainly, wrestled with it. Um, and, there have been, sort of moments, but all through my 20s, it was not something I thought about. It was not something I wanted. I, I had a long, like a 3-year relationship when I was right out of college. There was no way I was going to marry that person, even though he was a bit older and would have wanted that. When I finally did get married, I was 39. I mean, we had met when we were about 35, 36. And even that was hard because, you really like have established patterns and routines and it's much harder. But I really used to I mean, I'm embarrassed to say, I would kind of look down on my friends who got married in their 20s. I mean, I was living in New York City in my 20s and, it was like, the Sex in the City era kind of thing. And I had friends from high school who maybe got married in their early to mid 20s, and I remember thinking, "Oh my gosh, what's wrong with you?" And those people actually have much stronger marriages than the people who got married later, who I knew from the city or places like that. I mean, it's pretty remarkable. So I have egg on my face for sure.
I think statistically the sweet spot is somewhere between like 23 and 33 or something like that.
Oh, well, that's a big window
Right,
there.
yeah, but
Okay.
basically
Yeah.
marriages between teenagers don't last.
Right.
Unsurprisingly, unless you're in very conservative cultures, but in kind of second half of the 20th century West, right? And marriages when people are older are also less likely to last, which may be because of this set in your ways thing, that people are more, they can more take or leave it, I guess.
But I mean, and I actually just I'm working on an essay about this. There's not, I mean, there's so much discourse now about like people are, walking away from good relationships because they think they can do better, or there's this kind of like emotional dysfunction that's driving this. I mean, for my part, there's not one person that I dated in my 20s and into my 30s that I could have married or should have married or anything like that. So, I mean, I think we need to be very honest about the actual facts on the ground of people's lives. It's nice to say like, oh, well, we're so picky and we're so naive and we need to get serious about this. But, depending on your life and your situation and just luck of the draw, you're going to run into the people you run into. Now, I mean, I wasn't looking for somebody to settle down with. So that obviously I was selecting out for those people. Like I would date somebody sort of inappropriate because it was adventurous or interesting or some kind of anthropological journey, so I did a lot of that. But I mean, I know people who went to colleges, went to art school, and there were like, not a lot of straight men there. So they didn't meet any. And certainly before the age of dating apps, you didn't meet people if you didn't have a wide sort of swath of people in your real life to interact with. It was going to be a lot harder to meet somebody. Um, so I think people need to be kind of a little more charitable about that.